Is Davos ready for Donald Trump? In less than 2 weeks, the president is going to march his full economic team into the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. You could say he's walking into the lion's den, except that he's the lion. And the globalists know it. Yesterday, the New York Times shrieked that Donald Trump has set himself above international law. They wrote on topic after topic, President Trump made clear he would be the arbiter of any limits to his authority, not international law or treaties. But it's not international law they're worried about. It's their entire globalist system. And that is what Trump was actually telling the New York Times. And that is exactly what he's going to tell the gathered so-called international elite at Davos. He's crippled their dirty money laundromat in the Caribbean with the Venezuelan operation. He's declared war on the economic cartels, and he's withdrawn from 66 international organizations that are used to enforce globalist policies. Now, you're not supposed to notice any of that. You're supposed to be caught up in the play-by-play of the Minnesota ICE shootings, while the Democratic foot soldiers and the controlled media try to spin up their irregular warfare operations here at home. Well, Trump and his team aren't going to let them get away with that. Both J.D. Vance and Scott Bessent made that clear in the past 2 days.
What that headline leaves out is that woman is part of a broader left-wing network to attack, to dox, to assault, and to make it impossible for our ICE officers to do their job.
I'm Susan Kokinda, and I've seen how for decades the enemy keeps the American people in check by trapping them on the battlefields that the enemy chooses in order to keep patriots away from the real fight, which is bringing down the British imperial system. Well, Donald Trump is taking that system on, and if that's the fight you want to be a part of, I need you to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons so we can stay in touch and we can expand our reach on YouTube. Here's what we're going to cover today. How Trump is going to deliver the terms of surrender at Davos, that the Trump administration has already taken a direct strike on 66 transnational organizations, and how Treasury Secretary Bessent is bringing the fight right home here in Minnesota. So in less than 2 weeks, Donald Trump lands in Davos, and he's bringing with him a demolition crew. He's bringing Treasury Secretary Bessent, Commerce Secretary Lutnick, Energy Secretary Wright, Trade Representative Greer, and don't forget Trump's close confidant and diplomat of all trades, Steve Witkoff. Why this group? Because they represent all the elements that are replacing the British liberal free trade system. Lutnick and Greer are going to tell them that the era of sending American manufacturing capacity overseas and gutting our middle and working classes is over. Bessent is there to cut off the capital flows that prioritize global financial income streams over American wages. And Chris Wright, well, he's the walking refutation of the entire insane green agenda. And Steve Witkoff, well, he's the guy who gets things done for Donald Trump. But to really understand what Trump is doing in Davos, you're going to have to understand where Davos comes from. It was started in 1971. That was the year the British Empire dismantled the Bretton Woods financial system. That is the system that had stabilized economies in the post-war world. So the World Economic Forum was launched to begin to manage this post-1971 period. Everyone knows it was created by Klaus Schwab, but he had been mentored by Henry Kissinger at Harvard in the late 1960s. And let's not forget that Kissinger, later on, when he was Secretary of State, went on to say that in his Secretary of State capacity, he kept the British Foreign Office more closely informed than he did the State Department. So the establishment of the WEF in 1971 wasn't a coincidence. It was a transfer of power. As they killed off the power of sovereign governments to control their own credit, they built up a new temple for the transnational corporations that would rule in their place. And for 55 years, Davos has become one of the nodal points of this empire, and probably the most well-known. They don't use armies, they use ideology, and they have applied the ideology of the British Empire to the 21st century, and they've hijacked the world until now. And for all those years, researchers at Promethean Action have been exposing those operations whether it's the WEF or the Council on Foreign Relations, or the neoconservatives or their free trade ideology, and all the other groups and policies. More importantly, we know how to defeat them. So if you want to get into the real battle, head on over to Promethean Action and subscribe to our free newsletter, because we will continue to give you the up-to-date coverage of what Trump is really doing. Because in 10 days, Trump is going to the WEF. And contrary to the claims of the naggers and the heel biters within the MAGA movement, Donald Trump is not going to Switzerland to play nice with the Davos men. He and his team are arriving with a fully activated American system alternative to their policies of globalism and imperialism, and he will be laying down the terms of surrender. Now, he's already laid down some covering fire before his team heads out, hitting them exactly where it hurts, their networks of soft power. Just 3 days ago, the White House released a new finding withdrawing the United States from 66 international organizations, conventions, and treaty. Marco Rubio made clear they're pulling the plug on what he called a sprawling architecture of global governance, which, as he put it, serves the same elite networks of the multilateral NGO complex. And then Rubio drilled down on what this apparatus really is. He said, from DEA mandates to gender equality campaigns to climate orthodoxy, many international organizations now serve a globalist project rooted in the discredited fantasy of the end of history. These organizations actively seek to constrain American sovereignty. Now, the organizations that the U.S. is withdrawing from include the full gamut of green enforcement institutions that have been set up in the last few decades to enforce the carbon dioxide is poison policy, which is supposed to make nations deindustrialize. Also, some of these institutions that we're withdrawing from go all the way back to the very foundation of the UN in the late 1940s. And if you go back to the early days of the UN, you'll find people like Julian Huxley letting it all hang out as to the British plans for the UN, which, by the way, were contrary to Franklin Roosevelt's intentions. Huxley was the grandson of Thomas Huxley. Thomas had been the president of the British Royal Society, and he served on Queen Victoria's Privy Council in the heyday of the 19th century form of British imperialism. Julian was groomed to administer the same policies in their 20th century form, and so he became the first head of UNESCO when the UN was founded, where he took up several projects. First, he laid out what the purpose of UNESCO was. He said, in its educational program, it can stress the ultimate need for world political unity and familiarize all people with the implications of the transfer of full sovereignty from separate nations to a world organization. Remember what Marco Rubio just said? These organizations actively seek to constrain American sovereignty. And Huxley also had the slightly more delicate task of repackaging one of the empire's most evil policies, race science or eugenics. Here's what Huxley said in 1948. Even though it's quite true that any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake so that much that now is unthinkable may at least become thinkable. Let's not mince words. Huxley is saying Hitler gave eugenics a bad name, and we have to reframe it in the post-war world, and we're going to use these institutions to do it. So Huxley and many of the other card-carrying eugenicists became founders of the environmentalist movement, which ultimately metastasized into the green fascist organizations that the Trump administration just shut down. So by withdrawing from these 66 organizations and treaties, Trump and his team are stating clearly the U.S. is no longer abiding by your green zero growth policies, your human rights frauds that protect terrorists, and your Malthusian population reduction schemes. But the enemy doesn't just operate out of Davos or the UN. They have tentacles right here in the heartland of America. The chaos we're seeing in Minnesota and in other cities, the attacks on ICE, the rioting, this isn't organic. It's the same spider web. But the media is trying to keep you fixated on every new camera angle of the shooting in Minneapolis. Vice President J.D. Vance addressed the real issue.
What that headline leaves out is that that woman is part of a broader left-wing network to attack, to dox, to assault, and to make it impossible for our ICE officers to do their job. If the media wants to tell the truth, they ought to tell the truth that a group of left-wing radicals have been working tirelessly, sometimes using domestic terror techniques to try to make it impossible for the President of the United States to do what the American people elected him to do, which is enforce our immigration laws.
Vance is holding the shield, but Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is drawing the sword. While the media focuses on the street violence, Bessent is looking at the apparatus that funds it. He just announced a full investigation of the fraud surrounding the daycare centers and much, much more. He made clear that the Treasury's enforcement arm, FinCEN, along with the IRS, will be looking at financial institutions and at 501c3s. He's tracking the money that moves from the same globalist foundations that interface with the UN, that used to interface with USID before Trump shut it down, and other institutions. He's looking at how this moves directly into the accounts of domestic groups burning down our cities, and he's putting them all on notice.
We track, we follow the money, and we intend to follow it as much as we can, prosecute the individuals no matter where they are, whether they are in the Minnesota government or they are sitting in East Africa. We will find them.
Then Bessent made clear that this isn't just about daycare centers, that these are the same methods used by the cartels, and they will be investigated in the same way.
We view this crime as very similar to the cartels' money laundering, many of the same approaches, many of the same shell companies. So we will see where it goes out from here. That will be a starting point. And as I said, Minnesota is going to be the protocols, the procedures, and the investigative techniques, as well as the collaboration with other agencies. Minnesota is going to be the genesis for a national rollout.
Catch that last comment? This is a national rollout. These are all intertwined networks, the fraud, the cartels, drug money laundering, and the foot soldiers who are rioting and impeding ICE. This is the bottom of the apparatus that goes up through the global banking institutions, the UN, the NGOs, and the WEF. And Donald Trump is taking them on all at once. So let's step back and see what Trump has done in just the first 10 days of 2026. He smashed their offshore money laundering operations in the Caribbean. He's withdrawn from 66 transnational organizations and treaties that have been strangling American sovereignty, some since the UN was founded. His Treasury Secretary is now following the money right into the NGOs and the 501c3s that fund the foot soldiers attacking our law enforcement agents on American streets. This is a coordinated strike on every level of the spiderweb, from Davos to Minneapolis. So, sure, the New York Times is screaming that Trump has set himself above international law. Good, because their international law was never law. It was a cage built to keep America trapped inside a system designed by the British Empire and administered by their globalist heirs. Donald Trump is taking a jackhammer to that system. So if you want to stay focused on this, not the play-by-play distractions, but on the strategy to win the real war, then join us at Promethean Action. Get our free newsletter or become a paying member or a contributor. We need more people on the real battlefield mobilized to win this fight. We'll be back on Monday with another look at the Trump offensive. This has been your Saturday Brief. Thanks for watching.
Please take a moment and subscribe to our free newsletter at PrometheanAction.com.